Hey guys, tonight we begin with a force of nature so immense, so terrifyingly beautiful. It doesn't just rearrange deck chairs on your beach vacation, it reorganizes entire coastlines. We're diving into the complete, swirling, often devastating history of hurricanes, those monstrous meteorological marvels that have reshaped nations, shattered lives, and left an indelible mark on the human story. So, before you get comfortable, maybe find your emergency kit. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, a storm so vast it can cover an entire state. Winds so furious they rip homes from their foundations and turn ordinary objects into deadly projectiles. Water so relentless it swallows cities whole. We're talking about hurricanes, those atmospheric behemoths that spin out of the tropical oceans, gather unimaginable energy, and then unleash it all upon unsuspecting shores. They are, in essence, nature's way of reminding us who's really in charge. And they've been doing it for a very, very long time. For millennia, long before we had fancy satellite images and spaghetti models, our ancestors faced these terrifying tempests with nothing but folklore, desperate prayers, and the raw, unyielding courage of people trying to survive something utterly incomprehensible. Think about it. A giant, invisible hand sweeping across the sea, turning it into a furious, frothing monster, then slamming into land with the force of 1,000 exploding bombs. How do you prepare for that when your best weather forecast is a particularly itchy elbow? This isn't just a story about wind speeds and barometric pressure, though we'll touch on that. This is about how these colossal atmospheric engines have quite literally changed the course of human events. They've altered trade routes, toppled empires, well, almost, inspired myths, and forced entire populations to rethink where and how they build their lives. From ancient civilizations whispering about sea gods to modern metropolises grappling with rising tides and billion-dollar damages, the hurricane has been a constant, unwelcome, yet undeniably powerful player in the human drama. It's a tale of destruction, yes, but also of incredible resilience, innovation, and sometimes astonishing hubris. Because for every city that gets swallowed, there's another that stubbornly rebuilds. For every life lost, there are countless acts of heroism and community. So tonight, we're not just tracing the paths of infamous storms. We're exploring the deep, often uncomfortable relationship between humanity and the most powerful weather system on Earth. We'll look at the grand, sweeping tragedies, the quiet moments of despair, and the jaw-dropping stories of survival, all wrapped up in a package of swirling wind and relentless rain. This is the complete history of hurricanes that changed nations and more. All right, so we've talked about how hurricanes mess things up. But what is a hurricane? It sounds like a simple question, right? Like asking, what is a cat? Furry, purrs, judges you. But a hurricane is far more complex and frankly a lot less cuddly. Imagine the biggest, most aggressive vacuum cleaner in the world running on an endless supply of ocean energy and spinning so fast it warps time and space. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but close. At its heart, a hurricane is a massive rotating storm system characterized by low pressure centers, strong winds, and torrential rain. But how do these monsters even get started? It all begins with warm ocean water, and I mean warm. We're talking bathtub temperature, around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26.5 degrees Celsius, extending down about 150 feet, 50 meters. This superheated water is basically the hurricane's fuel. As the warm water evaporates, it rises, creating a low-pressure area near the surface. Think of it like a giant invisible chimney sucking up moisture. As more warm, moist air rises, it cools, condenses, and forms towering thunderclouds. And as that air rises, even more air rushes in to replace it, picking up moisture, heating up, and continuing the cycle. Now here's where the Earth itself gets involved. If this all happens far enough away from the equator, usually about 5 degrees latitude or more, something called the Coriolis effect kicks in. This is the force created by the Earth's rotation that makes moving objects, like air currents, deflect right in the northern hemisphere and left in the southern hemisphere. This deflective force starts to make that rushing air spin, slowly at first like a lazy whirlpool, then faster and faster, forming a distinct circulation. And just like that, you've got yourself a tropical disturbance. If conditions remain favorable, lots of warm water, low wind shear, meaning winds at different altitudes aren't ripping the storm apart, that disturbance can intensify. It goes from a tropical depression with sustained winds below 39 miles per hour, 63 kilometers per hour, to a tropical storm where winds are between 39 and 73 miles per hour, or 63 to 118 kilometers per hour. This is when they usually get a name, like Susan, or Greg, or oh God, not again. And if the winds keep howling and surpass 74 miles per hour, or 119 kilometers per hour, congratulations, you've officially got yourself a hurricane, or, depending on where you are in the world, a typhoon or a tropical cyclone. They're all the same beast, just with different regional nicknames. A fully formed hurricane has a distinct structure. In the very center, you have the eye, a deceptively calm, clear area with light winds and descending air. It's like the serene center of a chaotic donut. Surrounding that eye is the eye wall, a towering ring of the most intense thunderstorms, strongest winds, and heaviest rainfall. This is where the hurricane packs its nastiest punch. Beyond the eye wall, you have rain bands, spiraling arms of thunderstorms that extend outward, delivering more rain and wind, but usually less intensely than the eye wall. These can stretch for hundreds of miles, impacting areas far from the storm's center. To classify these whirling destroyers, meteorologists use scales like the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale. It categorizes hurricanes from Category 1 to 5 based on their sustained wind speeds. A Category 1 storm might knock out power and damage mobile homes, while a Category 5 is capable of catastrophic destruction, ripping roofs off houses, leveling entire neighborhoods, and rendering affected areas uninhabitable for weeks or months. It's the difference between a bad hair day and needing a new house. But here's the thing. Wind, while devastating, often isn't the deadliest part of a hurricane. That honor usually goes to the storm surge. This is an abnormal rise of water generated by the storm's winds pushing water onshore, often well above predicted astronomical tides. Imagine a giant wave, sometimes tens of feet high, simply swallowing coastal communities. It's like the ocean decided to move into your living room permanently. It's relentless, unstoppable, and historically responsible for the vast majority of hurricane-related fatalities. And finally, there's the rain. Oh, the rain. Hurricanes are basically giant moisture factories, sucking up vast quantities of water from the ocean and dumping it all over land. This can lead to widespread inland flooding, sometimes hundreds of miles from the coast, long after the winds have died down. It's a triple threat: wind, water pushed ashore, and water falling from the sky. And all of this, naturally, tends to put a serious damper on your beach vacation. So next time you see that spinning blob on the weather map, remember, it's not just bad weather. It's a complex, self-sustaining atmospheric engine fueled by warm water, Earth's rotation, and a seemingly insatiable desire to redecorate the planet. And now that we know what they are, let's look at how our ancestors dealt with these natural behemoths. So, you think you've had a bad storm. Imagine, for a moment, being an ancient fisherman watching the horizon. No Doppler radar, no satellite imagery, no weather app pinging your phone. Just the ominous shift in the wind,
the strange quiet before the fury, and a very, very strong feeling in your gut that the gods were having a terrible, no good, very bad day. Because for our ancient ancestors, a hurricane wasn't just a weather event. It was a divine tantrum, a cosmic slap, or at best, a really confusing omen. And how they dealt with these uninvited storms shaped their societies as much as any battle or harvest. For most early civilizations, the idea that a massive, swirling vortex of wind and water could be explained by air pressure and convection currents, that would sound like absolute madness. Instead, they ascribed these colossal atmospheric engines to the most powerful beings they knew, their gods. If a storm ripped through your coastal village, it wasn't because of an unusually warm patch of ocean. It was because Poseidon was angry, or Tlaloc was thirsty, or a particularly grumpy dragon was stretching its wings. And when a god got angry, you didn't just grab sandbags, you offered sacrifices, chanted prayers, and hoped your village wasn't the one getting the divine lightning bolt. In ancient Egypt, for example, the annual flooding of the Nile was predictable, a life-giving miracle they understood and celebrated. But what about the less polite storms that brewed out in the Red Sea or the distant Mediterranean? When an unexpected tempest slammed into the delta, drowning fields and toppling flimsy mud brick homes, it was a terrifying mystery. You'd pray to Ra, the sun god, to keep the sky clear, or perhaps plead with Set, the god of chaos, to direct his destructive energies elsewhere. Building codes? They consisted mostly of build near the river and pray it doesn't rain too hard. Their boats were, let's say, robust, but they weren't built to withstand a true hurricane's fury. Sailors would read the stars, feel the changes in the air, and if things looked truly dire, they'd simply beach their vessels and make very fast offerings to the nearest sea deity. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, floods were a constant threat they learned to manage with intricate irrigation. But from the Arabian Sea, cyclones could spin up, bringing devastation to the Persian Gulf. Here the priests would consult ominous omens, strange animal behavior, unusual cloud formations, even bizarre dreams. If a city was obliterated, it was a clear sign you defended a god, perhaps Enlil, the god of wind and storm, or Ishtar, who occasionally manifested as a destructive storm goddess when she was in a particularly bad mood. Their ziggurats, those towering step pyramids, weren't just temples. They were arguably the original high ground, places to escape the floods, if not the wrath of the heavens. Did they have a warning system? Yes, it was called "The Sky Looks Weird, Better Hide." When it came to the Greeks and Romans, seafaring was their lifeblood. They navigated the Mediterranean, a sea prone to sudden, violent storms, if not full-blown hurricanes as we know them today. Homer's epics are filled with terrifying accounts of ships being dashed to pieces by Poseidon's wrath. Odysseus famously faced monster waves and divine headwinds that made even the toughest sailor reconsider his career choice. This wasn't just literary flair, it was a reflection of a brutal reality. Roman generals would sacrifice entire herds to Neptune before embarking on a major naval campaign, hoping to appease the temperamental god of the sea. Their understanding of winds and currents was impressive for the time, but when the truly big one hit, even their mighty triremes were just kindle. Practical measures were limited: pull the ships ashore, seek shelter in natural coves, or simply ride out the storm and hope for the best. Evacuation plans? For citizens, it was often every person for themselves, scrambling to higher ground and praying to Jupiter or Zeus that their family survived the divine temper tantrum. Now, over in Mesoamerica, where the Caribbean hurricanes are practically an annual tradition, civilizations like the Maya and the Olmec had a different and perhaps even more terrifying relationship with these storms.
Their intricate calendars and astronomical observations allowed them to track celestial movements with incredible precision. But predicting a hurricane? That was left to the gods of wind and rain, like Kukulkan or Hurakan, the very word hurricane possibly deriving from his name. These deities often had dual aspects, life-giving and utterly destructive. To appease them, Rituals could be elaborate, sometimes involving human sacrifice. If the sky opened up and swallowed a village, it was believed that the gods demanded a terrible price to restore cosmic balance. Their cities, often built with monumental stone, were more resilient than straw huts, but still vulnerable to storm surges and relentless rains that could trigger floods and mudslides. They built water management systems, but even those buckled under the sheer force of nature. In ancient China, typhoons were a constant, devastating presence, often tied to dragon myths and the celestial mandate. A particularly brutal storm could be seen as a sign that the emperor had lost the favor of heaven, leading to political instability and, occasionally, a new dynasty. Chinese engineers developed sophisticated flood control measures along their mighty rivers, but coastal areas remained vulnerable. They observed patterns that the sheer unpredictability of these massive storms meant that preparedness was often a matter of reading the wind, observing animal behavior, and hoping that the dragon god was feeling generous. For all their ingenuity, ancient civilizations shared a fundamental vulnerability. They lacked the scientific understanding and technological tools to truly predict or mitigate the impact of hurricanes. They couldn't build storm-proof structures, couldn't issue mass evacuations beyond run for the hills, and couldn't even accurately forecast where the next big one would strike beyond observing atmospheric cues. Their best defense was often a strong dose of humility, a well-placed sacrifice, and the stubborn human will to rebuild, usually right back in the path of the next uninvited storm. They knew the rhythms of the seasons. They understood the power of the sea. But when nature decided to truly reorganize the coastline, they were largely at its mercy, clinging to their myths and their hope like a piece of driftwood in a furious ocean. And yet they endured. They learned to live with the tempest, to fear it, to respect it, and in doing so, they wove its destructive power into the very fabric of their beliefs, their art, and their understanding of the unpredictable world around them. Long before a wide-eyed European ever stumbled onto a Caribbean island, convinced they'd discovered a new paradise, nature had already perfected its favorite party trick in the region, the hurricane. These weren't new phenomena, just new to the written records that largely ignored millennia of indigenous experience. For the countless civilizations and tribal groups across the Americas, from the Caribbean archipelago to the Mesoamerican mainland, hurricanes were not an act of God in the Abrahamic sense. They were part of the very fabric of existence, as regular and terrifying as the changing seasons themselves. Imagine living on a small island, your entire world dependent on the sea and the land. Your homes are built from wood, reeds, and thatch. Your sustenance comes from fishing, growing corn, cassava, and sweet potatoes. You don't have satellite imagery or Doppler radar. Your weather forecast is the wisdom passed down through generations, the behavior of animals, and the ominous shift in the wind's breath. So when the sky begins to darken with unnatural speed, the air grows thick and humid, and the sea starts to pull back from the shore with an unnatural hunger, you know what's coming. It's not an unforeseen event, it's huracán. That's right, the very word hurricane is believed to derive from huracán, the powerful Quiché Mayan creator god of wind, storm, and fire. To the Maya, like many indigenous peoples, the storm wasn't a random act of chaos. It was a conscious, powerful entity, sometimes a force of cleansing and rebirth, sometimes of divine retribution. Their creation myths often featured devastating floods and fierce winds that wipe out previous attempts at humanity before the current world can truly begin. So when a Category 5 beast bore down, it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a cosmic event, a direct communication from the heavens, and you had to listen, often with your life. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture of life in the path of these ancient tempests. Sites across the Caribbean, particularly in places like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, show layers of storm-deposited sediment, indicating repeated massive flooding events over thousands of years. Some ancient settlements appear to have been suddenly abandoned, only to be reoccupied centuries later,
suggesting entire communities were wiped out or forced to relocate. Imagine rebuilding your entire life, not once, but every few decades, all because of an atmospheric tantrum. But these weren't passive victims. Indigenous societies developed sophisticated strategies for living with and surviving these recurring natural forces. Their building techniques, for example, were often more adaptable than early European colonial structures. Homes were often designed to be easily rebuilt, using flexible materials like thatch and wood that could bend with the wind or be replaced quickly after destruction. They understood the importance of diversification in agriculture, planting a variety of crops that might survive different conditions, ensuring that a single storm wouldn't completely decimate their food supply. And crucially, they had oral histories, passed down through generations, that served as vital warning systems and guides for resilience.
Consider the Taino people of the Greater Antilles, who cultivated conucos, raised earth mounds that protected crops from flooding, or the diverse fishing and farming practices that allowed communities to shift their food sources when coastal ecosystems were temporarily devastated. Their deep, intimate knowledge of the land, the sea, and the sky allowed them to read the subtle signs that heralded a coming storm. The changing currents, the unusual quiet in the air, the way the clouds gathered, these were their pre-industrial Doppler radar, honed over centuries of brutal lessons. And their myths and ceremonies weren't just stories. They were ways to explain the inexplicable, to find meaning in devastation, and to maintain spiritual balance in a world that could turn on a dime. So, when the European ships first arrived, carrying maps that labeled these lands new, they were sailing into a world that had already been shaped and reshaped by forces they couldn't even name. They introduced new diseases, new forms of governance, and new technologies, but they also brought new vulnerabilities. Their rigid, stone-built structures, designed for European climates and political stability, were woefully unprepared for the sheer, unbridled fury of a Caribbean hurricane. They saw them as an act of God, a sign of divine displeasure. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, however, they knew. They'd lived with these monsters for millennia, calling them names like Hurricane, a terrifying wind god that swept across the sea, leaving destruction in its wake. They built their homes to withstand it. They read the signs. They respected the power. Columbus, meanwhile, was too busy being Columbus. In 1494, on his second voyage, he was supposedly warned by local Arawak people about an impending storm. They saw the subtle shifts in the wind, the changes in the sky, the nervous behavior of the animals. They understood the language of the Hurricane. Columbus, of course, probably smiled, patted them on the head, and continued counting his gold doubloons. "Nonsense, native friends," you can almost hear him saying. "I am Columbus. I know the sea." Cut to absolute chaos. Just a few years later, in 1502, while on his fourth and final voyage, Columbus, now a seasoned Caribbean traveler, actually saw it coming. He noted the ominous signs, the unusual swell, the heavy, oppressive air, the strange light on the horizon. He was anchored near Hispaniola and tried to warn the governor, Nicolas Ovando, that a massive storm was brewing. He even asked for shelter for his fleet. Ovando, being a typical colonial administrator who probably thought Columbus was just getting old and dramatic, dismissed his warning. Ovando had a fleet of 30 ships, packed with the treasures of the New World, including, ironically, some of the gold Columbus had amassed, and a who's who of Spanish nobility and adventurers ready to sail back to Spain. He told Columbus, more or less, to take a hike. Columbus, ever the pragmatist when it suited him, took his 4 small caravels to a more sheltered cove. Ovando, with his cargo of gold and hubris, sailed directly into the path of what would become one of the deadliest hurricanes in recorded history. The storm hit with unimaginable ferocity. Winds ripped sails, waves the size of mountains swallowed galleons whole, and the sky turned into a maelstrom of rain and lightning. Of Ovando's 30 ships, only 4 survived. One of those survivors, by some twist of cruel fate, was the fastest ship in the fleet,
the one carrying Ovando and, you guessed it, the royal gold. The other 26 ships, along with hundreds of lives and vast amounts of treasure, were utterly obliterated. Ships sank with all hands, smashed against reefs, or simply vanished without a trace. It was a watery apocalypse. The hurricane not only delivered a devastating blow to Spanish colonial ambitions, but it also cemented a terrifying truth in the European mind. The New World had its own defenses, and they were far more powerful than any native army. The Hurricane was real, and it was a force to be reckoned with. For the first time, Europeans understood, in the most brutal way possible, that this new land wasn't just ripe for the taking. It fought back, and it did so with divine, furious winds that could reorganize a coastline and an entire fleet in a single terrifying night. Columbus, meanwhile, survived, anchored safely in his cove. He was probably muttering, "I told you so," under his breath, still convinced the universe was on his side. But for everyone else, the New World had delivered its first unforgettable warning. As the year 1780 rolled across the Caribbean, the air was thick with more than just humidity. It was charged with tension. The British, French, and Spanish empires were locked in a brutal struggle for colonial dominance, their navies constantly jockeying for position, their armies skirmishing over sugar islands. In this volatile mix, the last thing anyone expected was a force of nature to wade into the fight. But nature, as it often does, had its own plans. And in October of that year, it unleashed a storm so ferocious, so utterly unprecedented, that it earned a place in history not just as a natural disaster, but as a geopolitical disruptor. The Great Hurricane of 1780. This was the original "Oh no."
Now, imagine you're living in this era. Your weather forecast comes from a sailor's hunch, a sudden stillness in the air, or the frantic flight of birds. There's no radar, no satellite imagery, no concept of a storm's track beyond it's coming from that general direction. People understood that violent gales happened, of course, but they were viewed as acts of God or capricious spirits, not as predictable meteorological phenomena. So, when the first whispers of this monster began, nobody truly grasped the scale of the horror heading their way. The storm began its life like many do, a disturbance off the Cape Verde Islands. But something was different. It intensified rapidly, gaining power as it churned westward across the warm Atlantic. By the time it approached the Lesser Antilles in early October, it was already an atmospheric engine of unimaginable power. The first island to feel its wrath was Barbados, a vital British sugar colony and a key naval base. What unfolded there was less a storm and more an obliteration. Eyewitness accounts, passed down with a chilling blend of awe and terror, speak of winds that peeled bark from trees, lifted heavy cannons from fortifications, and rolled entire houses across the landscape like tumbleweeds. It wasn't just destruction, it was atomization. The island was literally scoured. Nothing was left standing, save for a few desperate souls clinging to the flattened earth. The winds were so extreme, they retroactively estimated them to be well over 200 miles per hour, pushing into the territory we now call a Category 5, and then some. Buildings didn't just collapse, they disintegrated. Ships were not just sunk, they were picked up and hurled inland. One report from Barbados described the astonishing sight of an 80-pound cannon being carried 140 yards from a fort. That's not wind. That's an invisible sledgehammer. The initial devastation was so complete that for days no one knew what had happened. Communication was severed, ships were gone, and the world was left to wonder about the fate of these distant, vulnerable islands. But the Great Hurricane wasn't content just with a single island. Its monstrous path continued northwest, engulfing the French island of Martinique, another crucial naval stronghold. There, the storm wreaked similar havoc, obliterating the capital of Saint-Pierre and destroying virtually every ship in the harbor. Then came St. Lucia, Dominica, and vast swaths of the archipelago. each island experiencing its own version of hell. The death toll was staggering. On Martinique alone, thousands perished. On St. Lucia, a major British base, all buildings were flattened, and the entire garrison was lost. Imagine the strategic implications for the warring empires, their navies, their supply lines, their very ability to wage war, utterly crippled by something they couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't even truly comprehend. This wasn't just a weather event, it was a naval catastrophe. Both the British and French fleets, already weakened by conflict, suffered immense losses. British Admiral George Rodney, who would famously secure naval dominance for Britain a couple of years later, arrived in the Caribbean shortly after the storm to find absolute ruin. His fleet was scattered, many ships lost, thousands of sailors drowned. The French were in a similar, if not worse, predicament, with countless vessels destroyed and their colonial ambitions severely set back. This single storm did more damage to these naval powers than any battle. It reshuffled the chessboard of colonial ambition, forcing a temporary cessation of hostilities just to deal with the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The human cost, however, was truly incomprehensible. While precise numbers are impossible to verify, conservative estimates place the death toll at over 22,000, making it the deadliest Atlantic hurricane on record. Many of these deaths were due to storm surge, the towering walls of water that swept inland, carrying everything before them. Others perished from falling debris, collapsing structures, or the sheer relentless force of the wind. On Barbados, the destruction was so absolute that survivors described it as if the island had been swept clean. The landscapes were utterly transformed, forests disappeared, fertile lands became barren, and the very shape of the coastline was altered. The economic impact was equally devastating. Sugar plantations, the lifeblood of these colonies, were wiped out. Buildings, equipment, crops, all gone. It took years, in some cases decades, for the islands to recover, and many never fully regained their pre-storm prosperity. The empires had to pour immense resources into reconstruction, diverting funds and manpower from their military campaigns. For the people who lived through it, the memory of the Great Hurricane of 1780 became a generational trauma, a stark reminder of humanity's fragility in the face of nature's raw power. They didn't have category scales back then, of course, but if they had, oh no, would have been a polite understatement for the original monster storm that literally swept away nations and redefined the meaning of meteorological fury. So, we've talked about these monstrous storms that reorganize coastlines and occasionally inspire new forms of prayer. But for centuries, humanity had a slight problem. What do you call something that has no name but just wiped out your entire fishing fleet? For a long time, people didn't really name hurricanes in the way we do now. They were simply the great storm of the year, or the big blow that happened when Cousin Ethel got married. Very descriptive, not very scientific. But then things got a little more poetic, if not less confusing.
The earliest formal-ish way of identifying individual hurricanes, particularly in the Caribbean and along the U.S. coast, was by the saint's day on which they occurred. Practical, if you happen to be deeply religious and carrying a saint calendar. So you'd get the San Felipe hurricane, which actually happened a few times because, well, there were a lot of San Felipes on the calendar. This led to a very particular problem. If you had two hurricanes on, say, the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, you then had the first San Felipe and the second San Felipe. Still not ideal for tracking or avoiding mass casualties. Imagine trying to evacuate when the news report says, "Brace yourselves for the third St. Augustine of Hippo storm of the season." You'd just shrug, light a candle, and hope for the best. Things started to get a bit more personal and delightfully eccentric in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Individuals, particularly meteorologists or weather enthusiasts, the original weather nerds, began to assign their own, often informal names. And this is where the sarcasm, and occasionally the misogyny, comes in. One of the most famous proponents of this informal naming system was an Australian meteorologist named Clement Wragg.
He's credited with using names of mythological figures, then, delightfully, names of politicians he disliked. Imagine a hurricane named Hurricane Johnson or Typhoon Trump making landfall. Rag clearly had a sense of humor, or at least a very passive-aggressive way of dealing with his political rivals. The idea was that giving storms human names made them easier to track, communicate about, and remember. And let's be honest, it made the news reports a lot more engaging. This informal system eventually caught on, particularly in the US, but it remained a bit chaotic. Everyone had their own pet names for storms, which, as you can imagine, wasn't great for global coordination. It wasn't until World War II that a more systematic, official approach began to take shape. U.S. Army, Air Corps, and Navy meteorologists dealing with numerous tropical storms in the Pacific realized they needed a clear, unambiguous way to identify these swirling death machines. And so they started using women's names. Why women's names? Well, the most common explanation is that naval meteorologists, perhaps due to a lack of imagination or an abundance of chivalry, named storms after their wives, girlfriends, or even their mother-in-laws. There's a persistent, unconfirmed rumor that it was indeed the mother-in-laws, which adds a delightful layer of passive aggression to nature's fury. Whatever the true origin, the practice stuck, spreading from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And for decades, every tropical storm that spun its way toward land was given a distinctly feminine identity. This practice continued for decades, becoming standard protocol for the U.S. Weather Bureau, later the National Weather Service. But as you can imagine, by the 1970s, society started to have some thoughts about naming all destructive forces of nature after women, and rightly so. Critics, particularly feminists, pointed out the obvious. Why were only women's names being used for these powerful, often destructive phenomena? It felt a bit, well, sexist. Imagine a particularly brutal storm named Agnes, followed by Brenda, then Carol. It wasn't exactly great PR for the female population. So, after a considerable amount of public pressure and common sense finally prevailing, the system evolved again. In 1979, male names were officially added to the list, creating alternating male and female names. So now you'd get Bob, followed by Carol, then David, then Elena. Much fairer, much less likely to inspire a gender study paper on meteorological misogyny. Today, the naming process is highly organized and overseen by the World Meteorological Organization, a body that probably takes itself very seriously. They maintain 6 rotating lists of names for each ocean basin, with a new list used each year. So if a name is on the list for 2024, it won't be used again until 2030, unless of course it's a particularly nasty storm. And that brings us to the retirement of names. If a hurricane is exceptionally devastating, causing widespread death or destruction, its name is retired permanently. It's like retiring a jersey number for an athlete, but for a force of nature that just flattened your town. Names like Katrina, Sandy, Maria, Andrew, these are no longer on any list. They've been retired out of respect for the victims and to avoid causing distress or trauma to survivors. You don't want to hear that Hurricane Katrina is coming again when your city is still trying to figure out how to rebuild. So a small committee of meteorological experts meets annually to decide which names get the boot, replacing them with new, hopefully less traumatic alternatives. The importance of naming goes beyond mere convenience. It provides a clear, concise way for meteorologists, emergency services, and the public to refer to a specific storm, reducing confusion during critical moments when every second counts. It helps track a storm's unique path, its intensity, and its historical impact. Imagine trying to talk about that big storm that hit Florida in October 2005 versus Hurricane Wilma. One is a mouthful, the other is a singular, recognizable entity. Naming helps us learn from the past, too. When we talk about the history of hurricanes, we're often talking about the stories attached to these names. From the devastating Great Storm of 1780 to the infamous Katrina, each name carries a narrative, a warning, and a testament to the raw power of nature. So whether it's a saint, a sarcastic politician, or a name chosen from a rotating list, giving these beasts a name is our way of trying to understand, remember, and perhaps, just perhaps, humble ourselves before the awesome power of the wind and the waves. Now that we know what to call them, let's explore some of the real heavy hitters, starting with the storms that literally changed the map.
Imagine, for a moment, a city that believed itself invincible. A shining jewel of the Gulf Coast, dripping with cotton wealth, boasting grand Victorian mansions and a bustling port. This was Galveston, Texas, circa 1900. It was known as the Wall Street of the South, a proud, confident metropolis, utterly convinced that no storm, no matter how mighty, could ever truly humble it. Why the hubris? Well, the locals had a theory. The shallow waters of Galveston Bay, they argued, would simply part or break up any serious hurricane before it could make landfall. Nature, they believed, had given them a natural force field. And as for a seawall, pish-posh, unnecessary, foolish even. Nobody needed a giant concrete barrier when the universe itself was apparently on your side. They were about to get America's most lethal surprise party. The stage for this nightmare was set in late August and early September of 1900. A tropical storm, not yet a full-blown monster, was churning across the Atlantic. Cuba, with its centuries of hurricane experience and a rather excellent meteorological service, tracked it. Their forecasters warned of a severe storm heading into the Gulf of Mexico. But the newly centralized U.S. Weather Bureau, based in Washington, D.C., had a bit of a, shall we say, control issue. They wanted all forecasts to originate from their august offices, dismissing any local expertise, especially from those pesky Cubans. So the warnings were downplayed, the severity understated. The storm, they predicted, would likely curve northeast harmlessly. This, dear friends, was mistake number one. In Galveston, a young, earnest meteorologist named Isaac Klein, working for the Weather Bureau, began to notice troubling signs. The swells were getting bigger, coming from an unusual direction. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like a blanket soaked in dread. His instruments, though rudimentary by today's standards, were telling him something was very wrong. Klein, a man who had lived through smaller storms, knew this was different. He tried to issue more dire warnings, but his hands were tied by the Bureau's strict rules. Local papers in Galveston printed only the watered-down federal forecast. The city, bathed in a deceptively beautiful calm on the morning of Saturday, September 8th, went about its business. The sun shone, the air was still, and hundreds of families headed to the beach, oblivious that the Gulf was about to swallow them whole. Then, the tide began to rise. Not a normal tide, but a relentless, surging push of water that kept climbing inch by agonizing inch until it spilled over the low-lying island. The city's confident smile began to falter. By early afternoon, the wind picked up, and by late afternoon, the storm surge hit. This wasn't a wave, it was a liquid wall, a tsunami of biblical proportions driven by winds that would later be estimated at over 145 miles per hour, a Category 4 monster. Houses, built on stilts, were simply lifted from their foundations and turned into battering rams, smashing into other homes, creating a horrifying cascade of splintered wood and human screams. The scale of the destruction was almost unimaginable. Galveston, a city built on a low sandy barrier island, offered no resistance. The water rose, quickly covering the entire island, in some places reaching 15 feet deep. The wind tore roofs off, shattered windows, and flung debris like deadly shrapnel. People clung to anything that floated, doors, planks, dead bodies, desperately trying to stay above the churning, murderous waters. The sounds were horrific. The roar of the wind, the crash of collapsing buildings, and the terrified cries of those trapped. Families huddled in their attics, only to have their homes ripped apart, plunging them into the maelstrom. In the morning, the city had been vibrant, confident. By nightfall, it was a watery, debris-strewn graveyard. And the storm surge, that invisible, irresistible force, was the primary killer. When the sun rose on September 9th, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. Galveston was obliterated. The thriving city, once a hub of commerce and ambition, was gone, replaced by a tangled, grotesque heap of rubble, mud, and corpses. Communication lines were severed, bridges destroyed. For days, the rest of the world had no idea what had happened. When the first survivor finally reached the mainland, their tales of horror were so unbelievable they were dismissed as delirium. But the truth was far worse. The Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 remains America's deadliest natural disaster. The official death toll is estimated at around 6,000, but many historians believe the true number could be as high as 12,000. Imagine that. Entire families, entire neighborhoods simply vanished. Thousands of bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or buried under mountains of debris. The aftermath was a grim, monumental task. Survivors, many injured and traumatized, searched for loved ones in the wreckage. Mass burials were necessary, often at sea, to prevent the spread of disease, a horrifying decision that haunted the city for decades. But Galveston, in its grief, refused to die. This was a city that learned its lesson the hardest way possible. Within years, they undertook one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history. They built a massive, 17-foot-high concrete seawall stretching for miles along the coast. And then, astonishingly, they razed the city entirely, literally pumping sand and mud beneath existing structures, lifting thousands of buildings by as much as 17 feet. It was an act of stubborn, defiant resilience, a promise to nature that never again would they be caught so utterly unprepared. The Galveston nightmare of 1900 served as a brutal, unforgettable lesson. Never underestimate the power of the sea, especially when it decides to crash your party.
All right, so we've watched these monstrous storms tear through history, reshaping land and lives. But how did anyone, back in the day, even know these things were coming? For centuries, predicting a hurricane was less about science and more about a desperate game of charades with Mother Nature. You didn't have a supercomputer crunching data, you had a gut feeling, a nervous goose, and maybe, if you were lucky, a really observant neighbor who knew when the sky looked wrong. We're talking about early warning signs that ranged from surprisingly astute observations to outright begging the gods not to ruin your Tuesday. Let's start with the OG meteorologists, indigenous peoples. Across the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and coastal regions globally, native populations developed incredibly keen observational skills. They lived intimately with their environment, and their survival depended on reading its subtle cues. They'd notice the ocean behaving strangely, with unusual swells or a sudden unnatural calm before a storm. Birds would cease their singing or fly inland in frantic flocks. Fish would hide. The air itself would often feel oppressive, heavy with an almost metallic humidity that promised trouble. The wind, too, would tell a story, a sudden shift in direction or an unnatural stillness. These weren't superstitions in the casual sense. They were hard-won lessons, honed over millennia of brutal experience. They knew that if the clouds looked like a grumpy dragon breathing fire, or the tide suddenly sucked way out from the shore, it was time to run for the hills, or at least tie down a canoe and make some very serious offerings to the storm god Hurricane. For European colonists sailing into these new turbulent waters, it was a steep learning curve, often paid in sunken ships and drowned sailors. They brought their European knowledge of gales and squalls, but found it woefully inadequate. They slowly and often painfully started to absorb indigenous wisdom, combining it with their own rudimentary scientific observations. Before long, sailors developed their own lore. When the waves run high and the wind is calm, look for a hurricane to come. Or, if the barometer falls quickly, pray to your patron saint, because things are about to get spicy. And speaking of barometers,
This, my friends, was the first real game changer in storm prediction. A tiny, unassuming tube of mercury or air that became the unsung hero of early meteorology. Invented in the mid-17th century by Evangelista Torricelli, a student of Galileo, the barometer was revolutionary because it could measure atmospheric pressure. See, hurricanes are, at their core, massive low-pressure systems. The lower the pressure, the more intense the storm. So if your mercury barometer started dropping like a rock, faster than a politician's approval ratings, you knew a serious storm was on its way. It was simple, elegant, and often brutally accurate. Suddenly, you weren't just guessing, you had a quantitative measure, a numerical warning, even if you didn't quite understand the physics behind it. You just knew, low reading, bad news, hide the rum. Sailors particularly latched on to the barometer. A sudden sustained drop in barometric pressure became a universal sign of impending doom. Ships would carry them, and their readings would be meticulously recorded in logbooks. Commanders learned to trust that little tube, even if the sky still looked deceptively clear. It allowed them, for the first time, to make informed decisions, trim sails, seek a sheltered harbor, or simply prepare for the beating of a lifetime. It was a step away from begging the gods, and a step towards understanding the atmosphere, even if only by reading its weight. But the barometer had its limits, of course. It could tell you a storm was coming and how intense it might be, but it couldn't tell you where it was going. For that, you still needed a crystal ball, or at least a very good spy in the sky. Beyond the barometer, other rudimentary tools played a part. Wind vanes, simple as they were, could indicate shifts in wind direction, which was crucial for understanding how a storm might be moving. Early anemometers could give a rough idea of wind speed, but they were often flimsy and broke in truly strong gales. Rain gauges, while useful for measuring precipitation after the fact, did little to predict future downpours. It was a patchwork of observations and simple instruments, constantly being refined through trial and error, often deadly error. Communication, too, was a massive hurdle. Even if a meteorologist on one island had a brilliant forecast, how did they get that warning to a coastal city hundreds of miles away in time? Before the telegraph and later radio, it was a slow, agonizing process. Warnings might travel by ship, often arriving too late, or by horse-drawn carriage, which was about as fast as a snail in molasses. The lack of real-time information meant that many coastal communities, despite the best efforts of a few dedicated observers, remained in the dark until the storm was literally upon them, delivering its lethal surprise party, as we saw with Galveston. And so, for centuries, the approach to hurricanes remained a strange blend of the ancient and the nascently scientific. You'd still make offerings to the sea gods, just in case. You'd still read the signs in the sky and watch the behavior of your livestock, but now you also had that little glass tube silently telling you that the air was getting light and things were about to get very heavy. It was a transition from the purely spiritual explanation to the physical, from passive acceptance to active, if often futile, preparation. This foundational period, however, laid the groundwork for the more advanced hurricane forecasting we rely on today. It taught humanity that knowledge, even if imperfect, was power in the face of nature's fury. And it made us realize that you can't stop a hurricane, but sometimes, just sometimes, knowing it's coming is the difference between life and death.
Imagine for a moment being a pilot. You've got your plane, your flight plan, and a big angry storm churning offshore. Now, imagine your mission briefing tells you not to fly around it, not to fly over it, but to fly directly into the very heart of that monster. Sounds like a scene from a bad Hollywood movie, right? Or perhaps a very efficient way to get your life insurance paid out. Yet for decades, that's exactly what a special breed of aviator has done, the hurricane hunters. Are they crazy, or just utterly undeniably committed to getting you a better forecast? The story of hurricane hunting, like many great innovations, started almost by accident, and frankly with a healthy dose of pure audacity. It was 1943, the middle of World War II. A tropical storm was bearing down on Houston, Texas, threatening a critical training mission for Army Air Forces pilots. Colonel Joseph Duckworth, a U.S. Army Air Forces pilot and instructor, made a spontaneous decision that probably made his superiors spit out their coffee. He
He took a single-engine AT-6 Texan trainer aircraft, not exactly a storm-fortified behemoth, more like a glorified tin can with wings, and flew straight into the eye wall. Not once, but twice that day, taking a weather officer along for the second ride just to prove it wasn't a fluke. His reasoning? He wanted to prove that you could fly into a hurricane and survive. The military, seeing the immediate value in getting real-time data from inside these storms, quickly decided this wasn't just a crazy stunt, it was a vital reconnaissance mission. And just like that, the hurricane hunters were born. Before these brave or delightfully unhinged pilots started intentionally flying into the tempest, hurricane forecasting was a bit of a guessing game. Meteorologists relied on limited ship reports, scattered coastal observations, and atmospheric pressure readings. This was like trying to understand an elephant by looking at its toenail clippings. You might get a hint, but you're not getting the full picture. The data was sparse, the predictions often vague, and the lead time for evacuations minimal. You didn't know if a storm was a mere bluster or a bona fide city-swallowing monster until it was practically knocking down your front door. The imperative was clear. Get inside the storm. Measure the pressure at its core, gauge the true wind speeds, locate the exact eye. That kind of data was gold, literally life-saving, but it required someone to fly through hell to get it. So, what does a hurricane hunter actually do in there? It's not just a joyride through turbulence. These are highly specialized scientific missions. The planes, usually rugged four-engine turboprops like the U.S. Air Force Reserve's WC-130J Super Hercules, or NOAA's P-3 Orions, affectionately known as Kermit and Miss Piggy, are packed with sophisticated instruments. They fly in a precise figure-4 pattern through the storm, crisscrossing the eye several times. Each pass involves collecting crucial data: temperature, humidity, pressure, and, of course, the actual wind speeds at various altitudes. They deploy dropsondes, small cylindrical packages with parachutes that fall through the atmosphere, beaming back real-time data on temperature, humidity, pressure, and wind direction as they descend to the ocean surface. This is how forecasters get that critical minimum central pressure, a key indicator of a hurricane's strength and intensity. And let's not sugarcoat it. This job is dangerous. Imagine flying through what feels like a giant washing machine full of rocks and lightning. The turbulence is severe, often throwing the plane hundreds of feet up or down in an instant. The rain can be so heavy, it feels like flying through concrete. Icing is a constant threat, as supercooled water freezes on contact with the aircraft, affecting its aerodynamics. Lightning strikes are common, sometimes temporarily blinding the crew or frying instruments. Visibility often drops to zero, and the roar of the wind outside is deafening even through the aircraft's thick skin. Pilots often describe the eye wall as the worst part, a violent, turbulent ring of air that batters the plane before it breaks into the deceptive calm of the eye. It's a job that requires not just exceptional piloting skills, but a level of mental fortitude that few possess. They are, in essence, flying laboratories, intentionally putting themselves in the path of destruction to gather the data that saves lives on the ground. And they do it regularly during hurricane season, sometimes multiple times a day. The impact of the hurricane hunters on forecast accuracy has been immense. Before their dedicated flights, a hurricane could suddenly intensify or change course without warning, leading to catastrophic surprises. Now, the data they collect feeds directly into complex computer models, allowing meteorologists to make more accurate predictions about a storm's intensity, track, and potential landfall. This precision translates directly into lives saved. More accurate forecasts mean better evacuation orders, earlier preparation, and more effective resource deployment. It means communities have hours, sometimes days, to get out of harm's way, secure their property, and brace for impact. It also reduces false alarms, saving billions in unnecessary evacuations and business closures. This isn't just about science, it's about practical life and death consequences. Today, hurricane hunting is primarily carried out by the U.S. Air Force Reserve's 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, based in Mississippi, and NOAA's Aircraft Operations Center, based in Florida. These dedicated men and women continue to fly into the heart of storms day in and day out, providing the critical data that keeps millions safer.
So back to our initial question. Are they crazy or just committed to the forecast? Well, maybe a little bit of both, but mostly they're heroes, strapping themselves into flying machines and facing down nature's fury so you don't have to. They are the front line of our defense against these monstrous storms, proving that sometimes the only way to beat a hurricane is to meet it head on. And without them, well, you'd probably be a lot more surprised when your beach vacation gets rearranged. Imagine New Orleans in 1965. It's a city steeped in jazz, gumbo, and a certain laissez-faire charm. It's also a city that, despite sitting in a hurricane bullseye, had a bit of a confidence problem when it came to its defenses. While it had seen its share of minor storms, a major hurricane direct hit hadn't been a reality for living memory in quite the same way. The city was protected, they believed, by a robust levee system designed to keep the Mississippi River in its place and, by extension, keep the Gulf of Mexico out. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a mischievous monster named Hurricane Betsy was about to deliver New Orleans its first big oops. Betsy wasn't just a storm. She was a meteorological trickster. She formed in late August, intensified, then took an infuriatingly erratic path doing a bizarre loop-de-loop in the Atlantic before finally deciding to head for the U.S. Gulf Coast. Forecasters, still reliant on less sophisticated models than today, struggled to pinpoint her true intentions. At first, it looked like Florida was in her crosshairs. Then, just as everyone relaxed, she shifted course. Suddenly, it was the central Gulf Coast, specifically New Orleans, that was squarely in her sights. Warnings went out, evacuations were advised, but for a city that had largely been spared major hurricane devastation for so long, there was an underlying current of, we've seen this before, she'll probably veer off. Betsy had other ideas. On September 9, 1965, Hurricane Betsy, a powerful Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour, slammed into southeast Louisiana. This wasn't a glancing blow. It was a direct hit, a knockout punch to a city built below sea level. The wind was ferocious, tearing roofs off homes, shattering windows, and transforming the iconic oaks of the Garden District into splintered timber. Power grids failed, communications went dead, and the city plunged into darkness, illuminated only by flashes of lightning and the occasional explosion from downed power lines. But the wind, as destructive as it was, wasn't the real problem for New Orleans. It was the water. And that's where the city's oops moment really began. Betsy brought a massive storm surge, pushing Gulf waters far inland and up the city's canals. And for the first time, in a truly catastrophic way, parts of New Orleans' levee system failed. Not the Mississippi River levees, which largely held, but the ones along the canals and in the back sections of the city, particularly in St. Bernard Parish and the lower Ninth Ward. These levees were, shall we say, built with a certain level of optimism, perhaps not fully anticipating the relentless rising pressure of a major storm surge. Breaches occurred in multiple locations, turning quiet neighborhoods into churning inland seas in a matter of minutes. The water poured in, swallowing homes, businesses, and lives. People woke up to water rapidly rising in their living rooms, forced to scramble onto rooftops, into attics, or wherever they could find a few feet of air. The flooding was extensive and prolonged. Entire sections of the city, already below sea level, became massive, murky lakes. In some areas, the water reached 8 to 10 feet deep, submerging homes almost entirely. Rescue efforts were immediate, but incredibly challenging. Coast Guard helicopters plucked people from rooftops, while improvised boat fleets navigated submerged streets, searching for survivors. The sheer volume of water, combined with the lack of power and communication, turned New Orleans into a desperate, isolated island. It was a stark, brutal realization for the city. The levees, their supposed impenetrable shield, were far from perfect. The storm lasted only a day, but the water lingered for weeks, a constant, grim reminder of Betsy's unwelcome visit. The aftermath was devastating. Hurricane Betsy claimed 81 lives and caused over $1.4 billion in damages. That's $1965, so imagine that in today's money, roughly $13 billion. The human toll was immense, but the psychological impact on New Orleans was arguably even greater. It was a wake-up call,
a shocking, undeniable demonstration of the city's profound vulnerability to storm surge and levee failure. The federal government, under President Lyndon J. Johnson, responded with significant aid and, importantly, pushed for substantial improvements to the city's flood protection system. In the years that followed, billions of dollars were indeed invested into reinforcing and expanding the levee system, particularly by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. New pumping stations were built, walls were raised, and the confidence in New Orleans flood protection grew once again. Betsy, they believed, was a one-off, a harsh lesson learned that would prevent future catastrophes. It was a critical moment in the city's history, a chance to truly understand and mitigate its unique risks. And for a while it seemed like the improvements were working, holding against subsequent less severe storms. But as we'll tragically discover later, the memory of Betsy's oops moment and the lessons it provided were unfortunately not fully heeded. And the city, decades later, would face a storm that made Betsy look like a gentle nudge. This was New Orleans' first major warning, a dress rehearsal, if you will, for a tragedy that would rewrite the very definition of a hurricane's impact.
Imagine for a moment the summer of 1969. The world was buzzing with Woodstock, the moon landing, and a general sense of optimistic chaos. But down on the U.S. Gulf Coast, a different kind of chaos was brewing. Just 4 years after Hurricane Betsy delivered New Orleans its rude awakening, another monster was forming in the Caribbean. This wasn't just another storm, this was Hurricane Camille, a force so utterly brutal, so unbelievably fierce that she redefined the very meaning of a destructive hurricane. She didn't just come ashore, she arrived like a wrathful deity, delivering a wall of water and a terrifying question. Why so fierce? Camille began her life in early August as a fairly unassuming tropical wave, but something extraordinary and terrifying happened as she moved across the warm waters of the Caribbean. She underwent what meteorologists now call rapid intensification. Think of it like a polite teacup poodle suddenly transforming into a snarling 500-pound grizzly bear in a matter of hours. From a mere tropical storm, Camille exploded into a Category 5 hurricane over the Western Caribbean, with sustained winds estimated at over 160 miles per hour in less than a day. Then she hit Cuba. And Cuba, unfortunately, experienced her full, terrifying might, resulting in significant damage and dozens of fatalities, though the world's attention was about to shift. After tearing through Cuba, Hurricane Camille roared into the Gulf of Mexico, still feeding on the superheated waters, and she continued to intensify, becoming one of the most powerful storms ever recorded to make landfall in the United States. Forecasters watched in a mixture of awe and dread as the satellite images, still relatively new technology, showed a perfectly formed, monstrous eye churning with malevolent purpose. Warnings were issued, evacuations urged, particularly along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a region directly in Camille's crosshairs. But for many, the idea of a storm this powerful, this fierce, was almost beyond comprehension. They'd heard of hurricanes, sure, but this was different. This was Camille. On the night of August 17, 1969, Hurricane Camille slammed into the Mississippi Gulf Coast near Waveland and Pass Christian. She was a Category 5 hurricane at landfall, with sustained winds estimated at an astonishing 175 miles per hour. That's faster than a high-speed train. But here's the kicker. Her winds were so powerful, they actually destroyed the instruments designed to measure them. The anemometer at the top of the Richelieu Apartments in Pass Christian, designed to withstand Category 5 winds, was ripped away before it could record the full force of her fury. So those 175-mile-per-hour winds, that's a conservative estimate. Camille might have been even stronger, a true beyond-the-scale monster. The sound of her arrival was described as a deafening roar, like 1,000 freight trains,
or a primal scream from the very heavens. It wasn't just wind, it was a physical assault. But like many hurricanes, Camille's deadliest weapon wasn't the wind, it was the water. She brought a colossal storm surge, estimated at an incredible 24.6 feet, that's 7.5 meters, in Pass Christian, Mississippi. Imagine a 3-story building made of solid ocean, relentlessly pushing inland, swallowing everything in its path. This wasn't a flood. This was an inland tsunami, a liquid wall that simply erased the coastline. Homes, businesses, entire towns were swept away, not just damaged, but utterly obliterated. People who had sought refuge in coastal buildings, believing they were safe above typical flood levels, were tragically drowned as the surge consumed them. The obliteration was so complete that in many areas, there was simply nothing left standing. No debris, no foundations, just a barren, scoured landscape where vibrant communities once stood.
The devastation along the Mississippi Gulf Coast was almost unimaginable. Towns like Pass Christian, Waveland, Bay St. Louis, and Gulfport were virtually wiped off the map. Roads vanished, bridges collapsed, and landmarks that had stood for generations were gone as if they had never existed. The storm left a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction, and the search and rescue efforts were monumental, but often futile, in the face of such widespread obliteration. The human toll was grim. Camille directly caused 143 fatalities along the Gulf Coast, but her story wasn't over. Like a vengeful spirit, she tracked northeast, weakening to a tropical depression, but still carrying an unimaginable amount of moisture. Days later, on August 19, Camille, now a soggy, less impressive-looking storm, dumped torrential rains on the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And this, for many, was the hidden, secondary catastrophe of Camille. In some areas, over 27 inches, or 685 millimeters of rain, fell in just a few hours. This unleashed cataclysmic flash flooding, mudslides and landslides. Rivers swelled into raging torrents, tearing through mountain communities, bridges, and homes. Entire towns were isolated, and the narrow valleys became death traps. Another 113 people lost their lives in Virginia due to these inland floods, bringing Camille's total death toll to 256. It was a stark reminder that a hurricane's fury doesn't always end at the coastline. The aftermath of Hurricane Camille was a national tragedy and a profound lesson. The sheer ferocity of the Category 5 winds, combined with the unprecedented storm surge, pushed the boundaries of what was thought survivable. It forced a reevaluation of building codes, particularly in coastal areas, leading to more stringent standards for wind resistance and elevation. It also emphasized the devastating power of storm surge, a silent killer that often overshadowed the more dramatic winds. For the meteorologists, Camille reinforced the urgency of hurricane research, pushing for better remote sensing technologies and more accurate models to predict rapid intensification. And for the survivors, Camille left an indelible scar, a wall of water and wind that simply consumed everything they knew. She was a brutal, unforgettable teacher, forever etched in the annals of hurricane history as the storm that asked, and tragically answered, the question, why so fierce?
Imagine, for a moment, a storm so focused, so utterly brutal, it didn't just smash houses, it vaporized them, leaving behind nothing but concrete slabs and the chilling question, what just happened? This was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. A storm that didn't just tear through South Florida, it ripped the lid off decades of lax building codes and exposed the fragile underbelly of explosive coastal development. It was the one that rewrote the rule book, or at least tried to, for how we build in hurricane country.
South Florida in the early 90s was a place synonymous with sunshine, rapid growth, and, frankly, a bit of an anything-goes attitude when it came to construction. Developers were slapping up subdivisions faster than you could say strip mall, and the building codes, like a lot of bad fashion choices from the 80s, were, shall we say, optional in many areas. Inspectors were overworked, regulations were often skirted, and the prevailing wisdom seemed to be that if it stood up long enough for the homeowner to move in, it was probably fine. Andrew was about to have a very different opinion on fine. Andrew was a bit of a meteorological enigma from the start. He was a relatively small hurricane, spatially, not a sprawling behemoth like some of the other giants we've discussed, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in pure, unadulterated intensity and speed. He formed in the Atlantic, spun his way through the Bahamas, and then, after a terrifying period of rapid intensification, bore down on South Florida like a tightly coiled spring, a meteorological guided missile aimed directly at Dade County. Forecasters watched in a mix of awe and dread as Andrew went from a barely there storm to a Category 5 monster in just 36 hours. This wasn't a gentle ramp-up. It was a sudden, terrifying punch in the face. In the pre-dawn hours of August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall south of Miami near Homestead, Florida, as a catastrophic Category 5 storm. Sustained winds roared at 165 miles per hour, with gusts reaching over 200 miles per hour in some areas. This wasn't just strong wind. This was the kind of wind that turns a 2x4 into a spear, a car into a twisted wreck, and a mobile home park into literal matchsticks. The storm surge, though overshadowed by the winds, was also significant, reaching up to 17 feet in some coastal areas, pushing seawater far inland. But the defining characteristic of Andrew's destruction wasn't just the wind or water. It was the sheer, brutal demolition of suburban homes. Unlike storms that primarily cause flooding or roof damage, Andrew ripped houses apart from the inside out. Walls crumbled, roofs disintegrated, and entire neighborhoods were rendered into unrecognizable piles of debris. It looked like a war zone, but the only enemy was the wind. The shocking part was why so many homes simply evaporated. The answer lay in the building codes, or rather, the lack of them, and their poor enforcement. Investigations in Andrew's wake revealed widespread, systemic failures in residential construction. Many homes, particularly those built during the rapid growth boom of the 1970s and 80s, were woefully inadequate for hurricane-force winds. Roofs weren't properly attached to walls. They were often just nailed down, allowing the wind to get underneath and lift them off like a lid. Garage doors, often flimsy and unreinforced, would buckle, allowing wind pressure to build inside the house, creating explosive forces that blew out walls and tore off roofs. Weak windows, shoddy materials, and a general rush to build quickly and cheaply meant that many structures simply weren't designed to withstand sustained Category 4 or 5 winds. It was a scandal wrapped in a tragedy. The human impact was immense and immediate. Over 25,000 homes were destroyed and 100,000 more were damaged, leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless. The death toll was surprisingly low for a storm of Andrew's intensity, officially 65, largely due to widespread evacuations and the storm's compact size. But the psychological trauma, the sheer scale of displacement, and the economic devastation were staggering. Andrew caused over $26 billion in damages, making it the costliest natural disaster in the U.S. history at the time. Entire communities, like Homestead and Florida City, were virtually wiped off the map. People lived in tents, in damaged cars, or wherever they could find shelter for weeks and months. The initial government response was criticized as slow and inadequate, forcing a reckoning with disaster preparedness at every level.
But from the literal wreckage of Andrew came a fierce determination to never let this happen again. This storm was the wake-up call that Florida desperately needed. In the aftermath, the state overhauled its building codes, creating what became known as the Florida Building Code, one of the strictest and most comprehensive in the nation. It mandated stronger roof attachments, impact-resistant windows and doors, reinforced concrete construction, and rigorous inspection processes. This wasn't just a tweak. It was a revolution in how homes were designed and built in high-wind zones. The code essentially said, you want to build here? Then build it to withstand a major hurricane, or don't build it at all. Did it fix everything? Mostly. While newer homes built under the stricter codes have shown remarkable resilience against subsequent hurricanes, older structures remain vulnerable, and constant vigilance is required to ensure compliance. Andrew forever changed the landscape of coastal construction in Florida and became a national case study in disaster preparedness and mitigation. He was the storm that exposed a fundamental flaw in our approach to building on vulnerable coastlines. And in doing so, Hurricane Andrew didn't just destroy homes. He forced us to rebuild our understanding of safety, resilience, and the relentless power of a truly unforgiving wind.
So, we've covered the charming, if slightly chaotic, history of naming these atmospheric beasts. From calling them San Juan because that's the saint's day they arrived, to having a disgruntled Australian meteorologist name them after politicians he found particularly windy, we've seen a journey from haphazard identification to a very particular kind of whimsy. And then, for decades, it was all female names, a roster of Agathas and Brendas spinning their way toward unsuspecting coastlines. But as society, thankfully, began to evolve, so too did our collective comfort with naming destructive forces of nature exclusively after women. And quite rightly, some folks, particularly feminists, started to ask, hey, what's with giving all the catastrophic storms lady names? Are we trying to say something here, Weather Bureau? The critique was simple. Consistently linking powerful, destructive phenomena with female names perpetuated a subtle yet pervasive sexist stereotype. It was a relic of a less enlightened time, a bit like those old-timey ads for cleaning products. By the 1970s, the public conversation shifted, and the U.S. Weather Bureau, later NOAA, finally took notice. The pressure mounted, arguments were made, and common sense, for once, prevailed. In 1979, a significant change was implemented. Male names were officially introduced into the rotating alphabetical lists for the Atlantic and Pacific basins. So instead of a parade of entirely female-named storms, you'd now have Bob, followed by Carol, then David, and so on. A bit more balanced, a lot less likely to inspire a gender studies thesis on meteorological bias, and certainly a step in the right direction. This shift from feminine whimsy to a more gender-neutral approach in naming wasn't just about political correctness. It reflected a growing maturity in how we perceived and communicated about these storms. It made the system more universally acceptable, which is crucial for international coordination and public understanding. And as the naming system evolved, so too did our awareness, and indeed, the impact of these storms. Names became shorthand, not just for a specific weather event, but for a whole range of consequences. Think about it. A name like Katrina isn't just a storm, it's a national tragedy, a policy failure, a stark reminder of vulnerability. Sandy isn't just a tropical cyclone, it's a superstorm that devastated a metropolis and exposed infrastructure weaknesses. Maria isn't just a name, it's a symbol of prolonged suffering and systemic neglect in Puerto Rico. These names, once perhaps a bit quaint, now carry immense psychological and historical weight. This gravity is precisely why, as we mentioned earlier, certain names get retired. If a hurricane is exceptionally devastating, causing widespread death or catastrophic damage, its name is permanently removed from the rotating lists.
It's a mark of respect for the victims and to avoid causing distress or trauma to survivors when they hear the name again. Imagine rebuilding your home after Hurricane Charlie, only to hear Charlie is back on the forecast a few years later. No thank you. The World Meteorological Organization's annual committee meeting to retire names is a somber but necessary ritual, acknowledging the human cost of these phenomena. Names like Betsy, Camille, Andrew, Katrina, Sandy, and Maria have now been etched into history, forever retired, serving as grim markers of monumental destruction. But beyond just the name, the impact of these storms has also arguably evolved. Are they getting stronger, more frequent? The science points towards a warming planet providing more fuel for these engines, potentially leading to more intense storms, and certainly contributing to higher storm surges due to rising sea levels. So the impact isn't just evolving because we're naming them differently, it's evolving because the world they're spinning in is changing. What might have been a regional disaster a century ago, now with denser coastal populations, more complex infrastructure, and a globally interconnected economy, becomes a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe that reverberates far beyond its immediate landfall. The evolution of naming, therefore, parallels an evolution in our understanding and the very nature of the threat. We've gone from simple identifiers to a sophisticated system that helps us track, predict, and communicate about a global phenomenon. And the names themselves have gone from mere labels to powerful symbols, etched in our collective memory, reminding us of the immense power of nature and the urgent need for preparedness, resilience, and a deeper conversation about our planet's future. From feminine whimsy to global threat, the names of these beasts now whisper not just about the storm, but about the very world we live in. And with that, let's dive into some of the more infamous examples that left an indelible mark on their respective regions. Imagine for a moment New Orleans in the early 2000s. After Hurricane Betsy in '65, billions had been poured into what was supposedly a fortified levee system. There was a sense of renewed confidence, a belief that the city, a vibrant, resilient, below-sea-level marvel, was finally safe from the Gulf's fury. They'd had close calls, sure, but the big one hadn't truly hit since before most residents were born. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in August of 2005, a name emerged from the Atlantic that would shatter that confidence and expose vulnerabilities far deeper than concrete walls. Hurricane Katrina. And it wasn't just a city that drowned, it was a nation exposed.
Katrina began as a seemingly innocuous tropical depression over the Bahamas. But then, as tropical disturbances often do, it decided to get serious. It crossed Florida as a Category 1, dumping rain, then roared into the incredibly warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And that, my friends, is where Katrina found her true purpose. Over the next 2 days, she underwent what's called rapid intensification, ballooning into an absolute monster, a terrifying Category 5 hurricane with sustained winds over 175 miles per hour. For a chilling moment, New Orleans was staring down the barrel of a direct Category 5 hit. The forecasts were dire, explicit, and terrifyingly accurate. This wasn't a surprise party. It was a very public, very loud warning. Evacuation orders were issued, mandatory for the first time in the city's history. Hundreds of thousands left, but many, especially the poor, the elderly, and those without transportation, simply couldn't. They were trapped, hoping for the best in a city that was about to experience its worst nightmare. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall. Not as the Category 5 everyone had braced for, she weakened slightly to a Category 3 just before hitting the Louisiana-Mississippi border. And in some twisted meteorological irony, the city of New Orleans was spared the absolute worst of Katrina's winds. The storm's most intense eye wall, that deadly donut of fury, passed to the east of the city,
hitting coastal Mississippi with apocalyptic force. Homes were leveled, entire towns wiped clean from the map. But for New Orleans, the real terror wasn't the wind. It was the water and the levees. The ones that had been upgraded, the ones that were supposed to protect the city. They failed. It began slowly, then with horrifying speed. The storm surge, pushed by Katrina's immense counterclockwise spin, funneled into Lake Pontchartrain, overwhelming the city's complex system of canals and protective walls. The 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, the Industrial Canal, multiple breaches occurred. These weren't just overtoppings, these were structural failures. Water poured into the city, first a trickle, then a torrent, then a raging flood. Because New Orleans sits like a bowl, much of it below sea level, the water had nowhere to go. Entire neighborhoods, including the lower Ninth Ward, Gentilly, and New Orleans East, were rapidly submerged. Homes that had withstood the wind were now floating in a murky, toxic soup. People scrambled to attics, then onto rooftops, desperately waving for help. It was a watery apocalypse, unfolding in slow motion, live on national television. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was an engineering failure, a systemic breakdown. The immediate aftermath was horrific. Tens of thousands of people were trapped in the flooded city, without food, water, power, or communication. The Louisiana Superdome, designated as a shelter of last resort, quickly devolved into a humanitarian crisis, overflowing with desperate citizens, sweltering heat, and rapidly deteriorating sanitation. The New Orleans Convention Center became an even worse scene of chaos, with bodies lying uncollected and people left for days without aid. The breakdown of law and order, amplified by sensationalized media reports, painted a grim picture of a city consumed by anarchy. Looting occurred, yes, but so did countless acts of kindness, courage, and desperate self-preservation. It became a stark image of America's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The response, particularly from the federal government, became a scathing indictment. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was widely criticized as slow, bureaucratic, and woefully unprepared. President George W. Bush's administration faced accusations of indifference and incompetence, particularly given the racial and class disparities evident in who was most affected and least able to escape. Images of desperate, predominantly black citizens stranded in a flooded city ignited a furious national debate about poverty, race, and infrastructure in America. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a deeply uncomfortable mirror reflecting systemic inequities that many preferred to ignore. The initial government response, a mixture of slow coordination, unclear leadership, and a shocking lack of resources, compounded the tragedy. It felt like a city had been abandoned, left to drown. Hurricane Katrina directly caused over 1,800 deaths, making it one of the deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history. The economic impact was staggering, estimated at over $125 billion, making it the costliest U.S. hurricane on record. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, many permanently, scattering New Orleanians across the country. The cultural impact was immense. A unique city, a cradle of American music and culture, faced an existential threat. But out of the wreckage came a fierce determination to rebuild, to resurrect New Orleans. This time, the lessons were supposedly learned, loudly and painfully. Billions more were poured into building a dramatically stronger levee system, a truly robust, modern defense designed to withstand a 100-year storm event. Emergency response protocols were overhauled, federal agencies reformed, and the national conversation about disaster preparedness, climate change, and social vulnerability was forever changed. Katrina was a brutal wake-up call, a testament to nature's power and a searing indictment of human failure. And while New Orleans has risen again, vibrant and defiant, the scars of Katrina remain a permanent reminder of a city drowned, a nation exposed, and the enduring question of whether we truly learned what we thought we learned.
Imagine, for a moment, an island already bruised. Just 2 weeks before, Hurricane Irma, a terrifying Category 5, had roared past Puerto Rico, causing significant damage, but mercifully not a direct hit. The island, a U.S. territory already struggling with a deep economic crisis and an aging infrastructure, was still catching its breath, still patching roofs, still trying to restore power to thousands. What could possibly go wrong now? Well, a name emerged from the Atlantic that would rip open those fresh wounds and plunge the island into a darkness that would last for months, not days. Hurricane Maria. And it wasn't just a storm, it was an unfolding tragedy, a stark reminder of vulnerability and a brutally long road home. Maria formed in mid-September 2017, already a nasty piece of work, but like a malevolent spirit, she found her true power over the incredibly warm waters of the Caribbean. What followed was a period of jaw-dropping rapid intensification. In just 24 hours, Maria transformed from a Category 1 hurricane to a monstrous Category 5 with sustained winds screaming at 175 miles per hour. Forecasters watched, horrified, as the perfectly formed eye of the storm set its sights squarely on Puerto Rico. Warnings were issued, dire and unambiguous. Evacuations were urged. But for an island that had just been battered with limited resources and vulnerable populations, preparing for this kind of absolute obliteration was almost impossible. Many simply had nowhere else to go. On September 20, 2017, Hurricane Maria made direct landfall on Puerto Rico near Yabucoa, still a brutal Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. This wasn't a glancing blow. It was a full-body tackle, a direct hit to the island's heart. The wind was apocalyptic, a deafening roar that lasted for hours, tearing roofs off homes, splintering trees, and transforming every loose object into a deadly projectile. Power lines snapped and fell like tangled spaghetti, plunging the entire island into total darkness. Communications went dead, cell towers collapsed, internet connections vanished, and landlines went silent. Puerto Rico was completely cut off from the outside world, a nation isolated in its suffering. But as always, the wind was just the opening act. Maria brought torrential, relentless rainfall, some areas receiving over 30 inches of water in just a few hours. This unleashed catastrophic flash flooding and terrifying mudslides and landslides, particularly in the mountainous interior. Rivers swelled into raging torrents, overflowing their banks, washing away homes, bridges, and entire communities. The island's already fragile infrastructure, including its aging dam system, was overwhelmed. The Guajataca Dam, a critical water supply for hundreds of thousands, suffered a catastrophic spillway failure, threatening widespread downstream flooding and forcing mass evacuations under impossible conditions. It was a watery nightmare, unfolding in the dark with no way to call for help. The immediate aftermath was a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. The entire island, 3.4 million American citizens, was without power. For many, this lasted for months, becoming the largest and longest blackout in U.S. history. Drinking water became scarce as water treatment plants failed and pipes were ruptured. Food supplies dwindled as roads were impassable, ports were closed, and supply chains evaporated. Fuel for generators was almost non-existent.
Hospitals, many already under financial strain, were operating on dwindling reserves, struggling to treat the injured, the sick, and those suffering from heat stroke and dehydration. Access to medical care became a desperate race against time. People trapped in isolated communities struggled to survive. Many resorted to desperate measures to find basic necessities. It was a breakdown of essential services on a scale rarely seen in modern U.S. history. The federal response to Maria became a lightning rod for intense criticism, exposing deep-seated issues about Puerto Rico's political status and the U.S. government's disaster preparedness. Critics, from local officials to international aid organizations, lambasted the response as slow, inadequate, and riddled with bureaucratic red tape. Comparisons to the faster, more robust responses seen in mainland disasters like Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas just weeks before, were stark and immediate. The perception of indifference, particularly from the Trump administration, deepened the sense of abandonment and frustration. Aid flowed, eventually, but often with frustrating delays, logistical hurdles, and a lack of clear leadership. Essential supplies sat in ports unable to reach desperate communities due to blocked roads and distribution failures. The official death toll, initially reported as 64, was later revised to nearly 3,000, primarily due to indirect causes like lack of medical care, power outages, and contaminated water. It became starkly clear Maria wasn't just bad weather, it was a brutal mirror reflecting systemic neglect and political disparities. The long-term consequences of Hurricane Maria have been immense and continue to unfold years later. The prolonged power outage crippled the economy, forcing businesses to close and accelerating a mass exodus of Puerto Ricans to the mainland USA. The island's already fragile healthcare system was pushed to the brink. Education suffered, and the psychological trauma, particularly for children, was profound. Recovery efforts have been slow and uneven, battling bureaucracy, funding disputes, and the sheer scale of the rebuilding required. Years after the storm, blue tarps still covered thousands of homes, a grim reminder of unfulfilled promises and ongoing vulnerability. Maria became more than just a name. It became a symbol of a vulnerable population, often forgotten, struggling to rebuild their lives in the shadow of a colossal natural disaster and a complex political relationship. The long road home for Puerto Rico is still very much being paved, one slow, painful step at a time.
Imagine for a moment a storm so powerful, it doesn't just flatten homes, it flattens entire regional economies. It doesn't just knock out power, it knocks out revenue streams for months, sometimes years. Because while the wind and water are the stars of the destructive show, the true villain, often lurking in the wings, is the billion-dollar bill. The colossal, staggering economic cost that hurricanes relentlessly rack up. They don't just reorganize coastlines, they remap economies, rewrite financial futures, and, as you've probably noticed, send your insurance premiums spiraling into the stratosphere. It's the hidden, long-term devastation that often lingers long after the waters recede and the wind dies down. Let's start with the obvious: direct damage. Houses, businesses, critical infrastructure all turn to rubble or submerged in a toxic soup. Think about all those grand Victorian mansions in Galveston, or the suburban sprawl in South Florida after Andrew, or the entire commercial districts swept away by Camille surge. It's not just the immediate cost of rebuilding, it's the lost value, the destroyed inventory, the decades of investment literally washed away in a single day. Roads vanish, bridges collapse, power grids become tangled spaghetti, and water treatment plants cease to function. Imagine the ripple effect. No roads, no commerce, no power, no business, no clean water, no health. This isn't just about property, it's about the very arteries of an economy being severed. But the direct hit is only the beginning. The indirect economic impacts are often far more insidious and widespread. Take tourism, for example. Coastal regions, especially in the Caribbean or Florida, live and breathe on tourist dollars. Hotels get destroyed, beaches are eroded, attractions are shut down. Even if a place rebuilds quickly, the perception of danger, the lingering damage, and the simple fact that people can't get there for months can decimate an entire season. Imagine a hotel that needs a year to rebuild, or a fishing charter business with no boats left. Those jobs, those revenues are gone, sending shockwaves through local communities that rely on that steady stream of vacationers. And it's not just big resorts, it's the small shops, the restaurants, the local guides, entire ecosystems of small businesses that vanish overnight. Then there's agriculture. Hurricanes don't just care about beachfront property, they care about crops. Entire fields of citrus, cotton, sugarcane, or corn can be utterly destroyed by wind, rain, and saltwater intrusion. Fishing fleets, the lifeblood of many coastal towns, are often annihilated, boats sunk or smashed, docks obliterated. This doesn't just impact local food supply, it disrupts national and even global supply chains. If a key agricultural region is wiped out, prices for those commodities can skyrocket across the country, affecting every grocery bill. And the long-term damage to ecosystems like oyster beds or shrimp grounds can take years, even decades to recover, impacting entire industries and the livelihoods of generations of workers. It's a bill that keeps coming due long after the storm fades from the headlines. And of course, the reconstruction itself is a monumental undertaking, measured in billions upon billions of dollars. Debris removal alone is a staggering cost, literally tens of millions of tons of trash, twisted metal, and shattered homes needing to be hauled away. Then comes the actual rebuilding, new homes, reinforced infrastructure, elevated roads, fortified power grids. Who pays for this colossal undertaking? Well, you do, and me, and everyone else who pays taxes. Federal agencies like FEMA, state disaster relief funds, and local governments are all stretched to their limits, incurring massive debts that impact national budgets for years. It's a huge burden on the taxpayer, a collective bill for climate consequences, and sometimes for past negligence in building practices. This brings us, inevitably, to the insurance industry. After a major hurricane, insurance companies are hit with a deluge of claims, billions of dollars in payouts for damaged homes, cars, businesses. This isn't charity, it's capitalism, and when an industry faces such massive losses, it responds in a predictable way. Your insurance premiums go up, way up. Especially in high-risk coastal areas, premiums can skyrocket, making it unaffordable for many to live there. Insurers might even withdraw from certain markets entirely, leaving homeowners scrambling for limited, expensive coverage. This impacts housing markets, property values, and the very demographics of coastal communities. It forces difficult questions. Is this place insurable anymore? Is it even livable? The long-term economic repercussions are profound. Beyond the immediate shock, hurricanes can trigger population shifts as displaced residents seek new homes and jobs elsewhere. This leads to brain drain in affected areas, a loss of skilled labor and entrepreneurial spirit. Businesses might not reopen, leading to permanent job losses and economic decline. The psychological toll, too, has an economic cost. Trauma, stress, and mental health issues can impact productivity and social cohesion. It's a slow, agonizing bleed rather than a quick cut. So while the television cameras move on for a few weeks, the affected communities are often just beginning their decades-long uphill battle for recovery. They're dealing with the lingering effects of that billion-dollar bill, a debt that's paid not just in cash, but in lost livelihoods, shattered dreams, and the quiet despair of lives irrevocably changed. It's a stark reminder that when a hurricane decides to remap the coast, it's not just carving new shorelines, it's drawing new economic realities, and sending you the bill for the privilege. All right, so we've journeyed through centuries of swirling destruction, from ancient peoples begging their gods to modern cities grappling with biblical floods. But as we look at the headlines, hear the scientific consensus, and perhaps, just perhaps, notice our own coastal communities feeling a little more nervous every hurricane season, a nagging question emerges. Are these storms getting angrier, or is it just us? Are hurricanes truly evolving into more frequent, more intense, more destructive monsters? Or is our perception just amplified by 24/7 news cycles and denser populations? It's the climate question, and it's as comfortable as a wetsuit in July.
For decades, the idea of climate change and its impact on extreme weather was often dismissed as theoretical, a distant problem for future generations. Now, the future, as it often does, has a way of arriving uninvited, and it's bringing stronger winds and higher tides. The science, for those willing to listen, points to a complex but increasingly clear picture. Our warming planet is indeed influencing tropical cyclones, even if it's not always in the ways you might expect. It's not necessarily about more hurricanes, but potentially about worse ones. Let's start with the most obvious culprit, warmer ocean water. Remember, warm ocean water is the hurricane's fuel. Think of it like a car engine. The more fuel you pour in, the more powerful it can become. As global temperatures rise, the oceans absorb a significant amount of that excess heat, leading to steadily warmer surface temperatures, particularly in the tropical regions where hurricanes are born. This provides a larger, more consistent energy source for these storms. So, while the number of named storms in a given year might fluctuate due to natural cycles like El Niño, the potential for individual storms to reach higher intensities, meaning Category 4 and 5, is increasing. It's like saying you might not roll more dice, but the ones you do roll are increasingly loaded towards the higher numbers. Then there's the issue of rising sea levels. This isn't just a distant problem for polar bears, it's a direct threat to every coastal community. As glaciers and ice sheets melt, and as ocean water expands from warming, global sea levels are creeping steadily upward. For hurricane impact, this is a nightmare. Even if a storm's intensity or surge doesn't increase, a higher baseline sea level means that storm surge, that deadly wall of water, can push further inland and cause more extensive flooding than it would have a century ago. Imagine trying to jump over a fence, but the ground on the other side is slowly rising. It just gets easier for the water to overwhelm coastal defenses and inundate communities. We're also seeing shifts in hurricane behavior that are deeply troubling. One key trend is an increase in rapid intensification events. This is when a tropical storm or hurricane strengthens very quickly, sometimes gaining 2 or more Saffir-Simpson categories in just 24 hours. Think of Andrew or Maria or Camille, storms that went from manageable to apocalyptic in terrifyingly short order. This rapid escalation leaves less time for preparation, less time for evacuations, and less time for emergency services to position resources. It turns a potential threat into a sudden, inescapable nightmare, catching communities off guard even with modern forecasting tools. Another observed trend is that some hurricanes are moving more slowly once they reach coastal areas. Picture a giant, powerful vacuum cleaner not just hitting your house, but lingering over it, sucking up everything for days. This stalling behavior means a storm can dump colossal amounts of rainfall over a single region, leading to catastrophic inland flooding, often far from the coast. Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which parked itself over Houston, is a prime example, delivering feet of rain rather than inches, and exposing vast vulnerabilities in urban drainage systems. It's not always the wind that kills. Sometimes it's the endless, relentless downpour. And finally, there's the human element. While the storms might be getting angrier, we're also making ourselves more vulnerable. Coastal populations have exploded in recent decades, with millions building homes and businesses in high-risk zones, often on fragile barrier islands or low-lying coastal plains. This means that even a historically average storm can now cause exponentially more damage simply because there's more stuff and more people in its path. Combine this increased exposure with an aging infrastructure in many coastal cities, and you have a recipe for compounding disaster. It's a tragic feedback loop. We build more, we increase the stakes, and the storms, fueled by a warming planet, are more likely to deliver a devastating blow. So, are hurricanes getting angrier, or is it just us? The scientific consensus leans towards yes, both. The Earth's climate is undeniably influencing these powerful storms, increasing their potential intensity, shifting their behavior, and amplifying their destructive capacity. And humanity, through rapid, often ill-considered coastal development, is simultaneously putting itself in greater harm's way. The climate question isn't just an academic debate, it's a direct, urgent challenge for coastal communities and national governments worldwide. It's forcing us to reconsider where and how we build, how we prepare, and how we learn to live with and adapt to a changing, more volatile planet. The tempests of tomorrow may be fiercer, but our response today will determine whether we simply endure them or learn to truly live with a more volatile planet. Alright, so we've watched these monstrous storms carve their names into history, leaving behind wreckage, trauma, and, occasionally, a new set of building codes. But after the dust settles, or rather, after the water recedes, comes the eternal nagging question: how do we build for the blow? Is it a matter of resilience, retreating from the coast, or in moments of desperation, just hoping more sandbags will do the trick? It's a dance as old as human settlement, but with a terrifying twist. The music is getting louder, and the dance floor is shrinking.
For centuries, humanity built where it wanted, often with a healthy dose of hubris and a side of ignorance. Coastal areas were prime real estate, easy access for trade, beautiful views, prime fishing spots. And our ancestors, with their straw huts and flimsy wooden structures, learned the hard way that the ocean sometimes has different plans for your beachfront property. Later, with the rise of modern construction, there was a widespread belief that technology could conquer nature. We built grand cities on barrier islands, slapped up subdivisions in floodplains, and poured concrete wherever the land was cheap, often with building codes that were, shall we say, more like polite suggestions than ironclad rules. "She'll probably veer off" became the unofficial motto of many a coastal town, right up until the storm surge arrived. As we saw with Galveston, and later with the sprawling, rapid development of pre-Andrew Florida, this approach led to catastrophic, often deadly surprise parties. The hard lessons, as always, came wrapped in tragedy. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 didn't just tear through South Florida, it exposed a literal house of cards, revealing decades of shoddy construction and lax enforcement. Homes simply disintegrated, not because the storm was unprecedented, but because the structures themselves were woefully inadequate. Then came Katrina in 2005, a storm that highlighted not just inadequate levees, but systemic failures in infrastructure, communication, and social equity. And most recently, Maria, in 2017, laid bare the terrifying vulnerability of an island with aging systems and a precarious political status. These weren't just bad weather days, they were brutal wake-up calls, forcing a reckoning with how, where, and even if we should build in nature's firing line. So, what are our options when Mother Nature decides to redecorate? The first and most common strategy is resilience. Building stronger, hardening our defenses, and learning to live with the threat. This involves a revolution in building codes. After Andrew, Florida implemented some of the strictest building codes in the nation, mandating stronger roof connections, impact-resistant windows, and elevated foundations. Homes built under these newer codes have shown remarkable durability against subsequent storms, sometimes standing tall amidst older, shattered structures. It's like putting your house on a serious gym regimen, making it strong enough to take a punch. Beyond individual homes, resilience means hardening critical infrastructure, burying power lines, elevating substations, reinforcing bridges, and, yes, building bigger, stronger, more sophisticated levee systems as New Orleans undertook after Katrina. It's a massive, expensive undertaking, constantly battling rising costs, bureaucratic red tape, and the sheer challenge of retrofitting existing vulnerable communities. You can't exactly tell everyone in an old seaside town to tear down their charming century-old homes and rebuild to Category 5 standards overnight. The cost, the disruption, the sheer sentimental attachment, it's a monumental hurdle.
The second, more controversial strategy is retreat. This means actively moving away from the most vulnerable coastal areas. It's the opposite of stubborn defiance. It's managed retreat, strategic relocation, or simply discouraging new construction in high-risk zones that are likely to be swallowed by rising seas or frequent storm surges. This might involve government buyout programs for homes in repeatedly flooded areas, land use policies that restrict development on barrier islands, or even the gradual abandonment of entire communities. Sounds logical, right? But telling someone their family home, their livelihood, their entire community is now deemed untenable is a political hot potato of epic proportions. The economic impact on coastal towns that rely on tourism and fishing can be devastating, and the emotional attachment people have to their homes is incredibly powerful. It's hard to put a price on generations of memories, or to convince a town to just pack up and leave. So while scientific consensus often points to retreat as a long-term necessity,
Practical implementation is riddled with complexities, protests, and a lot of very angry residents. And then there's the third strategy, the one we often fall back on in moments of panic. Just more sandbags. This represents the immediate, temporary measures, the plywood over windows, the sandbags piled against doors, the frantic last-minute trips to the hardware store for batteries and bottled water. It's essential for short-term safety and preparedness, buying precious hours or days. But it's also a stark reminder of our limitations. A mountain of sandbags won't stop a 20-foot storm surge. Plywood over windows won't save a house from 150-mile-per-hour winds. These are stopgap measures, necessary for survival, but not true solutions for long-term protection against the escalating power of modern hurricanes. They're the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. Necessary for the moment, but not the cure. Adding to this already complex equation is the undeniable reality of climate change. A warming planet means warmer oceans, which are essentially super fuel for hurricanes. This can lead to more rapid intensification, potentially stronger storms, and, with rising sea levels, higher and more devastating storm surges. So the blow we're building for isn't static. It's evolving, intensifying. The Category 3 of today might bring the same impact as a Category 4 from decades past, due to coastal development and sea level rise. This raises profound questions. How much can we harden? At what cost? And when does resilience become futile, forcing an inevitable retreat?
The choice between resilience, retreat, or just more sandbags is not simple. It's a multi-billion-dollar, politically charged, emotionally fraught dilemma. It's about balancing economic development with safety, individual property rights with collective vulnerability, and the stubborn human will to stay put versus the undeniable forces of nature. There are no easy answers, only ongoing debates, incremental improvements, and the constant, grim reminder that even with all our technology, when a true monster spins out of the ocean, we are still, fundamentally, at its mercy. But we keep building, we keep adapting, and we keep learning, because the alternative, giving up on our coastlines entirely, feels like a defeat humanity is not yet ready to accept. And in that stubborn refusal to yield, there's a certain kind of resilient, if sometimes foolish, courage. All right, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the sheer, unbridled fury of hurricanes, the winds that rip, the waters that swallow, the economic devastation that lingers like a bad smell. But here's the thing. After every monster storm, after every city is reduced to rubble, and every coastline resculpted, there's another force that rises from the wreckage. A force as powerful, as unpredictable, and sometimes as stubbornly illogical as the hurricane itself, the human spirit. This isn't a story of magic, but of raw, messy, often tear-stained resilience, from the desperate fight for survival to the agonizingly slow yet utterly defiant act of rebuilding. And it's a story that's been repeating itself for millennia, right up to the last named storm. Imagine the immediate aftermath. The deafening roar of the wind has finally died down, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. All you can hear is the drip of water, the creak of trained timber, and maybe the distant cry for help. Your home is gone, your street is a river, and your entire world has been turned upside down, literally. In those first terrifying hours and days, it's not governments or grand rescue operations that save lives, it's neighbors. It's the man with the John boat navigating submerged streets, pulling strangers from attics. It's the woman with the last can of beans, sharing it with anyone who knocks. It's the impromptu triage centers set up in damaged churches, the whispered prayers, the shared exhaustion. Communication lines are down, power is out, and the only news you get is from the eyes of the person standing next to you. This is pure, unvarnished survival, stripped bare of all modern comforts, revealing humanity at its most vulnerable and often at its most courageous. Think about the stories we've heard, the people clinging to rooftops for days after Katrina, the families sheltering in shattered school buses after Andrew, the communities isolated by mudslides in Puerto Rico after Maria. These aren't just statistics, they're moments of raw, desperate ingenuity.
It's the improvised rafts, the signaling with flashlights, the sheer will to hold on to a piece of debris for hours as the waters rage. And when the first glimpse of a rescue helicopter or a National Guard truck finally appears, it's not just aid arriving, it's a sliver of hope, a reconnection to a world that felt utterly lost. The human body, it turns out, can withstand an incredible amount of battering, but the spirit, that needs a reason to keep going, a tiny flicker in the overwhelming darkness. Then comes the long, grinding process of recovery, which begins not with grand pronouncements, but with a shovel. It's the slow, back-breaking work of clearing debris, digging out mud, salvaging what little remains. And this is where the stubbornness really kicks in. Despite everything, people come back. They survey the wreckage, their eyes often filled with tears, but also with a defiant glint that says, "You thought you got rid of me, didn't you, you big windy jerk? Well, I'm still here." It's the collective will of a community, fueled by deep-rooted connections to place, to family, to history. Think of Galveston after the 1900 nightmare. They didn't just rebuild, they literally raised the entire city, defying gravity and the sea, all to say, we're not going anywhere. That's not just resilience, that's pure, unadulterated defiance, a human middle finger to the hurricane. The emotional toll, of course, is immense. Grief for lost loved ones, trauma from the terrifying experience, the exhaustion of constant uncertainty. Many people, particularly the elderly and the poor, are displaced permanently, their communities shattered, their connections severed. The economic burden is staggering, often pushing families into deeper poverty or forcing them to rebuild with limited or no insurance. The political battles over aid, the bureaucratic nightmares, the slow pace of government response, all of this compounds the suffering. It's not a quick fix. It's a marathon of paperwork, waiting and hoping that promises made by distant politicians will actually materialize. And for every well-funded rebuild, there are countless hidden struggles, quiet acts of desperation, and communities that simply never fully recover. But even in these shadows, the human spirit continues to flicker, refusing to be entirely snuffed out. Yet despite all this, communities often rise again. New Orleans, after Katrina, became a global symbol of this stubborn rebuilding. They faced not just the water, but the world's doubt, the national neglect, and the sheer magnitude of the task. And yet, the jazz still played, the food still cooked, and the people, slowly but surely, returned. They rebuilt their homes, revitalized their culture, and fought tooth and nail for their identity. It's not perfect, and the scars run deep, but the city stands as a testament to what happens when people simply refuse to give up on a place they love, no matter how many times nature tries to reclaim it. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, that their unique spirit is intrinsically tied to that vulnerable land.
So, why do they do it? Why do people choose to return to the coastlines, to the islands, to the river deltas that have repeatedly proven to be hurricane magnets? Part of it is economic. It's where their livelihoods are, where generations have lived. But much of it is deeper. It's the fierce, unyielding bond to home, to history, to community. It's the idea that a place, once deeply loved, can be remade, reimagined, and defended against all odds. It's the human spirit, not just surviving the storm, but stubbornly, defiantly rebuilding in its wake, creating new memories on the same ground where old ones were washed away. Because ultimately, for all its destructive power, a hurricane can flatten homes, but it rarely breaks the human will. And that, my friends, is a force as awe-inspiring as any storm. All right, so we've journeyed through centuries of swirling destruction, from ancient peoples begging their gods to modern cities grappling with biblical floods. We've seen how prediction has evolved, from a nervous goose to a very sophisticated spaghetti model. But as we look ahead into a future shaped by ever-advancing technology and a changing climate, a crucial question remains. How much closer can we get to truly predicting the unpredictable? And what might your smartwatch, or even your smart toaster, have to say about the next monster swirling in the Gulf? Today, we stand on the shoulders of meteorological giants, literally. Satellites circle the Earth, providing continuous, high-resolution imagery of every tropical disturbance. Supercomputers crunch trillions of data points from ocean buoys, weather balloons, and those wonderfully insane hurricane hunters flying directly into the eye. Our forecast models are light years ahead of the simple barometers of old, giving us days, sometimes even a week of lead time before a hurricane makes landfall. This has undoubtedly saved countless lives and billions in property. But even with all this horsepower, hurricanes remain notoriously fickle beasts, capable of infuriating last-minute shifts in intensity or track. Think of a storm doing a sudden, unexpected pirouette, or a mild Category 1 exploding into a Category 4 in mere hours. These rapid intensification events are still the bane of forecasters' existence. So what's next on the horizon for predicting the unpredictable? Get ready for a major assist from artificial intelligence and machine learning. Imagine AI models sifting through petabytes of historical hurricane data, satellite imagery, and atmospheric conditions, recognizing patterns that human eyes might miss. These algorithms aren't just looking at what's happening now, they're learning from every storm that ever was, spotting subtle atmospheric nudges that might signal rapid intensification or a sudden turn. They could soon provide much higher confidence forecasts, extending lead times, and giving communities crucial extra hours or even a full day to prepare or evacuate. Think of it as a super-powered, hyper-observant meteorological brain working 24/7, constantly refining its gut feeling with cold, hard data.
Beyond AI, new sensing technologies are pushing the boundaries. Picture swarms of autonomous drones flying into the lower levels of a hurricane, collecting granular data from just above the ocean's surface, something current aircraft can't safely do. Or underwater gliders silently patrolling the ocean, transmitting real-time data on subsurface water temperatures, that deep hidden fuel source for these storms. New constellations of tiny, cheaper satellites could provide even more frequent updates, capturing minute-by-minute changes in a storm structure. It's about getting more data from more places, more often, creating a truly three-dimensional, real-time picture of these complex systems. And this leads to perhaps the most intriguing frontier: hyper-localized, personalized warnings. Imagine a future where you don't just get a general hurricane warning for your county. Instead, your smart devices receive an alert specifically tailored to your street, your house, even your apartment floor. Based on advanced modeling that factors in your specific elevation, drainage, and building materials, your phone might vibrate with a message that says, "Warning, storm surge is projected to reach 4.7 feet at your exact address. Recommend evacuating within 2 hours." Or, "Your home is projected to experience Category 3 winds. Secure all outdoor furniture and consider boarding windows." This isn't science fiction anymore. It's the logical extension of increasingly precise data and AI capabilities. This is where your smartwatch or other wearables might step in. Beyond just delivering the alert, imagine passive environmental sensors built into your home devices, constantly monitoring atmospheric pressure, humidity, or even the subtle vibrations of local wind conditions, then cross-referencing that with official forecasts. Your smartwatch might give you a haptic alert, a subtle vibration, hours before a major storm hits, simply because it detects a rapid pressure drop that signals impending danger. Or perhaps it could even monitor your personal stress levels and offer a gentle reminder to check local emergency alerts, knowing that the atmosphere is getting tense. It's the ultimate integration of cutting-edge forecasting with personal safety, bringing the immense power of global weather prediction directly to your wrist or your pocket. But here's the crucial caveat. Despite all the supercomputers, all the satellites, all the AI, and all the smartwatches, hurricanes will always retain an element of the unpredictable. Nature, in its rawest, most powerful form, doesn't care about our algorithms. The chaos inherent in these systems, the subtle atmospheric interactions, the tiny butterfly effects that can alter a storm's path by hundreds of miles, these elements ensure that meteorology will always remain as much an art as a science. We can build stronger, predict better, and warn faster. But the final act, the ultimate power, still rests with the swirling fury of the wind and the relentless rise of the water. So while your smartwatch might one day tell you the exact moment to run, the real challenge will always be listening, learning, and respecting the raw, untamed power that continues to rearrange our coastlines. Because ultimately, the future of dealing with hurricanes isn't just about predicting them. It's about humility, preparedness, and the enduring human spirit that learns to live with and build for the inevitable.